They told J.D. Vance to leave, expecting him to get angry, but his response left the whole diner in silence. J.D. Vance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a modest spot in the middle of Springfield, Ohio. It was the kind of place that had been around for decades, its neon sign flickering slightly, the scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee slipping through the door every time someone walked in or out. He had heard about it from a local earlier that day, someone who swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. Exhausted from a long day of meetings, handshakes, and policy discussions, all he wanted was a quiet meal before the drive back. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The place was small but welcoming, or at least that's how it felt at first. The kind of diner where the same handful of regulars occupied the same booths every night. And a wall of faded Polaroids by the register showcased decades of customers and staff. The air was thick with the scent of bacon grease and brewed coffee. The low hum of conversation filled the room as J.D. caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She was mid-smile until she recognized him. It was quick, barely a second. But he noticed it, a hesitation, the kind that flickered across a person's face when they suddenly weren't sure what to do. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Glancing around, he saw a few customers had turned their heads in his direction. One man, halfway through his burger, leaned in and whispered something to the person across from him. Another, a woman in a flannel shirt, set down her coffee cup a little too hard, her eyes narrowing slightly before looking away. J.D. wasn't naive. He'd been in enough rooms to sense when he wasn't entirely welcome. But a diner? Here? The hostess hesitated, then stepped forward, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Good evening," she said carefully. "Are you dining in or taking out?" J.D. let out a small, tired chuckle. "Dining in, if that's all right." Another pause. Too long for such a simple question. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at him. "I need to check something real quick. Just one moment." She disappeared through the swinging door, leaving J.D. standing there as more heads turned his way. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered under their breath. Something wasn't right. The seconds stretched on, and from behind, the kitchen door's muffled voices rose and fell, too indistinct to make out. J.D. exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't going to assume anything either. Maybe there was a policy. Maybe they were short-staffed. Maybe... The hostess returned. This time, she didn't look uncertain. She looked decided. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice firmer. "Now. We can't serve you tonight." But the way she said it, the way the whole room seemed to tighten around her words, made it clear this wasn't about business. This was personal. For a brief moment, J.D. Vance said nothing. The words just sat there between them, thick and heavy, the kind of statement that didn't need an explanation. The diner had gone quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough. The sizzle of the grill in the back still crackled, a fork scraped against, a plate somewhere. But the usual hum of conversation had dulled. People were watching, waiting. J.D. studied the hostess's face. She wasn't hostile, just firm, like she'd made up her mind, or maybe someone else had made it up for her. His eyes flicked past her toward the kitchen window, where a pair of cooks stood just beyond, watching. The counter, half hidden behind a heat lamp stacked with plates, offered no clues. Their expressions were unreadable. J.D. cleared his throat. "I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong?" The hostess didn't fidget this time. "It's just... We'd rather not serve you tonight." No policy. No, "We're closing soon." Just that. J.D. let his hands settle on his hips, exhaling through his nose. He'd been in his fair share of uncomfortable situations, from political debates to interviews designed to trip him up, but there was something different about being turned away from a place as simple as a roadside diner. A cough broke the moment. J.D. turned slightly. catching the gaze of an older man near the counter, someone who looked like he'd been coming here for years. His blue work jacket was frayed at the cuffs, his hands weathered from a lifetime of labor. He shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, before stabbing at the last of his eggs. A few booths over, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed like he was enjoying the show. J.D. took it all in, the eyes that looked away the second they met his, the ones that lingered too long, and the ones that held something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had options. He could walk out, shake his head, and let it go. He could demand an explanation, call them out, ask if they had any idea how this would look in the morning news cycle. He could challenge them outright, see if they'd stick to their decision once they realized they were refusing a U.S. senator. Instead, he did none of those things. "All right," he said, nodding slowly, his voice even and measured. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated again, glancing toward the kitchen as if asking for silent permission. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath. Someone near the window let out a short laugh, like they couldn't believe he was actually going through with this. J.D. just stood there, waiting. The hostess disappeared again, this time through a different door. A few more beats of silence, a sip of coffee, a plate sliding across the counter. Then the door swung open. A man in his early 50s stepped out. Broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. His name tag read, Don. Don didn't ask J.D. what he wanted. He just looked J.D. over once before saying, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it wasn't welcoming. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. J.D. Vance met Don's stare, steady and unreadable. He wasn't here to argue, wasn't here to throw his weight around, but he also wasn't about to walk out without understanding why. "Yeah," J.D. said. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply through his nose, like he'd been expecting the question but still wasn't in the mood to answer. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing toward the handful of customers still watching. Some pretended not to listen. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. "Look," Don said, shifting his weight. "This ain't personal." J.D. raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally sighed. "People around here got their opinions about you, about the things you stand for. I got a business to run and I don't want trouble." J.D. nodded slowly, letting the words settle. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter, where the old man in the work jacket had gone back to his eggs, chewing a little slower now. A few booths away, others watched, waiting. The younger guy still had his arms crossed, watching like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. J.D. had seen this before, not exactly like this, but close enough. It wasn't just about one decision, it was about what it meant, how it would look, how people would react. It was about the ripple effect, the pressure from all sides, the silent expectations that pushed people into choices they weren't sure about. He glanced back at Don. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated, his fingers curling slightly against his apron, and for the first time, J.D. saw something that almost looked like discomfort, like maybe Don wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to seem. But before he could answer, the younger guy in the booth let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." J.D. turned toward him, studying him for a moment. He looked like the kind of guy who enjoyed a good fight, someone who had been waiting for an excuse to say something. J.D. didn't bite. He just looked back at Don. "I've got no problem leaving if that's really what you want." The words hung there, giving Don a chance to reconsider, to push back against whatever pressure had led to this moment. His gaze flicked toward the kitchen, then back to JD. "I just don't want things to get ugly," he said finally. JD nodded. "Neither do I." For a long moment, neither spoke. JD could have walked out, could have turned this into a headline. Let the internet do what it does best. But instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Then let's talk." The room tensed. He hadn't slammed the chair down, hadn't raised his voice. He just sat, hands resting on the table like he had all the time in the world. The diner wasn't used to this. Confrontations here usually ended quickly with someone storming out or shutting down. But this wasn't that. Don let out a slow exhale. "Talk," he repeated like the word itself didn't belong here. JD shrugged. "You don't want me here, I get that. What I don't get is why. So let's talk about it." A low chuckle came from the younger guy in the booth. "Man, this guy's got nerve." JD ignored him. Don pulled out the chair across from JD but didn't sit, just stood there, considering. The younger guy scoffed. "That's all you're gonna say?" JD turned toward him. "What else do you want me to say?" The guy straightened in his seat. "I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue, defend yourself. Say something." JD rested his forearms on the table. "You already made up your mind about me before I walked through that door. You wanted me to get mad, to fight back, so you could feel justified." The guy's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. JD continued, his voice steady. "But what if I told you I know exactly what that frustration feels like?" He looked back at Don. "You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. Hell, I felt left behind. And yeah, I went to school, did things people never expected me to do. But that doesn't mean I forgot." Don's fingers tapped against the chair, his expression unreadable but thoughtful. JD glanced around the diner. "You don't have to. Agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds. But I walked in here as a customer, not a politician. Just a guy looking for a meal." A pause. Then, from the counter, the old man in the work jacket muttered, "Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger." The tension cracked just slightly. A few people smirked, and even Don let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. JD turned back to him. "So, what now?" Don exhaled, running a hand over his face, glancing toward the kitchen where the cooks were still watching before looking back at JD. "I'll tell you what," Don finally said. "You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu." JD nodded, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Sounds like a deal." For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something closer to a conversation. The air in the diner had shifted. The stiffness in Don's shoulders had eased just a little, and the younger guy in the booth had lost his smirk, now sitting up instead of leaning back like this was some kind of show. Even the customers who had stayed quiet, just watching from the sidelines, seemed less certain of their own judgments. JD leaned forward slightly. "All right," he said, his voice calm. "Let's finish this conversation." Don exhaled and finally dropped into the chair across from him, looking tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long shift, but the kind that settles deep in a person. The counter paused mid-step. The younger guy in the booth shifted like he wasn't sure what to make of it, and even Don seemed to consider the words. JD didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just gave a slow nod, letting the moment settle. "That's all I can do," he said finally. "Listen, show up, and prove, if I get the chance, that I'm not just another guy passing through." Don rubbed a hand over his face again, exhaling like he was carrying the weight of 100 conversations just like this one. "Maybe that's the problem," he muttered. Too many folks talking, not enough proving. JD tapped his knuckle against the table again, thoughtful. Then let me prove it. A beat of silence stretched between them, then Don sighed, glancing toward the waitress. Bring him a menu. The room shifted. Not a full turn, but enough. The tension had eased, replaced by something quieter, something that felt a little less like a standoff and a little more like an understanding. The atmosphere had shifted, not entirely warm, but no longer hostile. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the grill, the quiet hum of conversation, it all started up again, like the diner itself had let out a breath it didn't know it was holding. JD leaned back slightly, glancing around, taking in the faces that had been watching him moments ago. Some still looked wary, others indifferent. But a few, just a few, seemed curious now, like they weren't so sure about the assumptions they'd walked in with. Don crossed his arms, still studying him like a man trying to solve a puzzle. You know, he said, shaking his head, you could have just left. JD smirked, setting the menu down. Yeah, he said, but then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Don huffed out a small laugh, then nodded toward the kitchen. Hope you like your burger medium. And just like that, the night moved on. Not as it started, but maybe, just maybe, as something better. The news by morning. JD shrugged, setting his cup down. Maybe, he said. But what would that change? Don studied him for a long moment, then shook his head with a quiet chuckle. Hell if I know. The diner had settled into something resembling normal again, but the air still carried the weight of what had just happened, of what was still happening. The old man at the counter stirred his coffee, sneaking a glance JD's way. The younger guy in the booth wasn't smirking anymore, just watching, arms, still crossed but less certain. Mery, the waitress, hovered near the counter like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. Don finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You're a stubborn one, I'll give you that. JD smirked. You run a diner. I bet you've dealt with worse. Don huffed out a small laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, he admitted, but not like this. But the tension had eased, replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding. JD finished his burger, taking his time, while Don leaned back in his chair, still watching him like he wasn't sure what to make of him. The old man, at the counter, sipped his coffee, shaking his head with the kind of amusement that only came with age. The younger guy in the booth hadn't spoken again, but his arms weren't crossed so tightly anymore. Mery refilled JD's coffee without being asked, muttering, still strong, and this time JD just smiled. The diner had returned to itself, not completely, not in a way that erased what had happened, but in a way that made room for it. As JD stood to leave, Don exhaled, shaking his head one last time. Still not sure I like you, he muttered. JD tossed a few bills on the table, smirking. Still not sure it matters. Doubts still lingered, but for one night in one small town, a different kind of conversation had taken place, and maybe that was enough. In a world where everyone is quick to argue, sometimes the real power lies in staying, listening, and proving, if only for a moment, that not everything has to be a fight. Now, I have a question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to decide between walking away and staying to listen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.